Get off my property before I call the police on you myself. Claire Whitmore's voice cracked on the last word, her hands shaking around a folder that held 6 months of another man's crimes. Behind her stood 4 Hell's Angels, arms crossed, saying nothing, needing nothing. A man in an expensive suit had just driven onto Black Ridge Auto Salvage, believing he still owned her. Nobody expected the woman who arrived with $42 to become the reason his empire started cracking. But that moment was still weeks away. This story begins on a burning Tuesday morning, when every single person before her had already said no. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and follow this channel all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The gate at Black Ridge Auto Salvage had a reputation before Claire Whitmore ever touched it. 7 people had walked through it in 6 months. 7 people had walked back out faster than they walked in. Some quit after 1 shift. 1 man quit after 20 minutes standing in the gravel lot shaking his head, saying he didn't sign up to work for bikers. Claire didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that her feet hurt, her stomach was empty, and the number in her bank account had a minus sign in front of it that she was starting to think would never go away. She stood at the gate for almost a full minute before she made herself walk through it. The noise hit her, first metal grinding against metal, an engine gunning somewhere out of sight, a radio playing classic rock through blown-out speakers. Then the men, big men, men with leather vests and tattooed forearms, in the kind of stillness that made most people cross the street. Nobody stopped what they were doing to look at her. That somehow made it worse. She found the office by process of elimination, the only door that wasn't a garage bay, and knocked twice before she let herself walk in. The man behind the desk didn't look up right away. He was reading something, a clipboard, maybe his reading glasses pushed low on his nose in a way that looked almost gentle next to the rest of him. Gray beard, silver hair cut close, a black vest with patches she didn't understand yet. "We're not hiring," he said without looking up. "The sign outside says you are." Now he looked up. Dylan McCall had been called Razor by every man in this yard for over 20 years, and in that time, he had learned to read people in about 4 seconds. Desperate people, broke people, people running from something. He looked at all 3 in front of him now. "Sign's old," he said. "Should have taken it down. Please." Claire heard her own voice do something she hated crack just slightly right in the middle of the word. "I don't need an easy job. I need a chance." Dylan set the clipboard down. He studied her for a long moment, the suitcase that looked expensive, but had a broken wheel the way she stood with her shoulders pulled in, like she was trying to take up less space in the world, the eyes that hadn't slept properly in longer than a few days. "You know what this place is?" he asked. "A scrapyard." "It's a scrapyard owned by Hell's Angels," he said, watching her face carefully when he said it the way he always did, the way that told him everything. "You know what that means to most people who walk through that gate?" "I don't care what it means to most people. Everybody says that. Then they see the yard, then they meet the men, then they're gone by Friday." Claire's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. "Mr. McCall." "Dylan's fine." "Dylan." She said the name like she was testing whether she was even allowed to. "I've had a week where a man threatened to take my car, my apartment, and my name back like they were his to take in the first place. I've slept in my car twice this month. I have $42 and a resume nobody wants to look at because the last 2 years of my life don't exist on paper because I spent them being controlled by someone instead of being employed by someone." Her voice steadied as she went, like saying it out loud made it more true, more solid, something she could stand on. "So no, I don't think this place is going to scare me." Dylan didn't answer right away. In the silence, a mechanic named Jake Turner leaned his head through the open office door, 26 oil-streaked forearms, a grin that hadn't learned yet when to disappear. "She's still standing there, Razor," Jake said. "Thought the last one left crying before she even got past the gate." "I'm not her," Claire said without turning around. Jake's grin faltered just slightly. He hadn't expected an answer. Dylan almost smiled. Almost. "This place doesn't forgive mistakes," he said instead, low, deliberate, a warning dressed up as a sentence. "You mess up an invoice, we lose a customer. You mess up a title transfer, we lose a truck. You mess with anybody's trust in this yard, you don't get a second conversation. You understand." Claire looked past him, out through the office window at the mountains of stripped metal glinting under the Arizona sun, at men who didn't know her yet and clearly weren't in a hurry to. Neither did the world outside, she said. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dylan reached into the drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk. Fill this out, he said. You start now, not tomorrow, now. Claire's hands were shaking again as she picked up the pen, but this time it wasn't fear. By lunchtime, 3 different men had walked past the office just to look at her the way you'd look at something that shouldn't still be there. Jake told 2 of the older guys she'd be gone before Friday. Nobody argued with him. Nobody was wrong to bet against her based on the last 7. But nobody had met Claire yet either. She started with the worst job in the building, 6 years of unfiled paperwork stuffed into boxes that had been shoved into a back closet, and mostly forgotten invoices, water-damaged vehicle titles, mixed with lunch receipts, a filing system that wasn't a system at all. She didn't complain. She sat down on the floor of that closet at 1:40 in the afternoon and didn't stand up again until almost 6. Jake found her there when he came looking for a part number. You're still here, he said, more surprised than anything else in his voice. Where else would I be? Most people give up on that closet in about an hour. Claire held up a stack of papers, sorted, clipped, labeled in handwriting, so careful it looked almost printed. I found 4 invoices from a supplier you're still paying, but who apparently stopped delivering parts 8 months ago. She held up a second stack. And this is a title for a truck that's still listed as sold to somebody who returned it 11 months ago. You've been paying insurance on a vehicle that isn't yours to insure anymore. Jake's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it for a second. That's how much is that costing us? I haven't finished counting, but it's not small. Jake stood in the doorway for a long moment, recalculating something behind his eyes. Huh, he said finally, and walked away without another word, which from Jake was as close to respect as anyone had gotten out of him in weeks. Claire didn't see it. She was already back in the boxes. That night, after everyone else had gone, she stayed behind under the single buzzing light of the office, going through numbers Dylan hadn't asked her to touch yet. She told herself it was because she needed to prove herself. The truth sat underneath that quieter, uglier. She stayed because the office was safer than wherever she'd have to go if she left. She had a motel reservation for one more night. After that, she didn't know. She heard the office door creak, and her whole body went rigid before she even turned around. It was only Dylan. You're still here, he said, the same words Jake had used earlier, but heavier in his mouth, more like an accusation. I wanted to finish the ledger. It's almost 9. I know. Dylan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying her, the way he'd studied her that morning. Except this time there was something else behind it. Not suspicion, calculation. You got somewhere to be, he asked. Claire's pen stopped moving. She could have lied. She'd gotten good at lying these last 2 years, smiling when she wanted to scream, saying she was fine when she wasn't telling people nothing was wrong, because admitting something was wrong meant admitting she'd let it get that bad. Not really, she said instead, and hated how small her voice sounded. Dylan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and set them on the desk in front of her. There's a room in the back, he said. Used to be for a night watchman before we had the cameras installed. Cot, bathroom, space heater. Nobody's used it in 2 years. Claire stared at the keys like they might disappear if she looked away. I'm not asking for... I know what you're not asking for, Dylan said. I'm not offering it because you asked. I'm offering it because I've got eyes and I know what a person looks like when they've got nowhere to go. Claire's throat tightened. She looked down at the ledger instead of at him because looking at him felt like it might break something loose in her chest that she wasn't ready to let out. Why? She asked quietly. Dylan considered the question longer than she expected. Because $42 and a busted suitcase wheel is exactly what everybody in this yard walked in with once, he said. Every man out there, every single one. He nodded toward the window, toward the yard, toward the men who'd spent all afternoon assuming she'd be gone by Friday. You think we all came from stable, easy lives. This place isn't full of criminals, Claire. It's full of people the rest of the world already gave up on. Claire looked up at him. I'm not giving up on this, she said. Not on this job, not on myself, not again. Something shifted in Dylan's face, not quite a smile, but close. Good, he said, because Friday's not a deadline in this yard. It's just a day. He left the keys on the desk and walked out, and Claire sat there for a long moment after the door closed, staring at them, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could remember. Not safety exactly, but the possibility of it. The next morning, she was at the gate before Dylan even arrived. Jake noticed first. He came around the corner with a wrench in one hand, stops, looked at her, standing there with a coffee she'd bought with money she didn't really have to spare, and shook his head. "You're actually back," he said. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because that's usually when people quit. Second day, first day's adrenaline, second day's when it actually hits. This is real, this is every day, this is forever." Claire took a sip of the coffee. "I've survived worse mornings than a scrapyard, Jake." Something in the way she said it made Jake's grin fade for the second time in 2 days. He didn't ask what she meant, but he filed it away the way people do when they hear something that sounds like a door they're not invited to open. By the end of her first full week, Claire had reorganized every filing cabinet in the building, caught 2 more billing errors, and found a check for $1,100 that had been sitting uncashed in a drawer for 4 months because nobody had thought to look. She'd also learned the names of every man in the yard, not because anyone introduced her, but because she made it her business to know who she was working alongside. Big Marcus, no relation, she made herself say silently, a small flinch every time the name came up, who ran the engine bay. Preacher 61, quiet, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, who never explained why, and nobody ever asked. Tommy, the youngest full member, who reminded her a little of the men Marcus used to be friends with before she understood what those friendships actually meant. She kept her distance from Tommy without fully understanding why at first. It took her 3 days to realize it was because something about the way he smiled reminded her of the version of Marcus that had existed before the wedding invitations went out, before she'd understood what she was actually agreeing to when she said yes. She pushed the thought down every time it surfaced, the way she'd learned to push down a lot of things. It didn't always work. One afternoon, sorting through an old filing box in the back office, she found a folder of vehicle titles from a business called Hale Property Group, unrelated. She told herself a coincidence of a common last name, nothing more, and her hands had gone cold and still for almost a full minute before she made herself keep working. She didn't tell anyone why. She didn't tell anyone about Marcus at all, not his name, not what he'd done, not the 2 years she'd spent believing that if she just tried harder, apologized more, needed less, things would go back to how they'd been at the beginning. She told herself the silence was protecting her. Some nights alone in the little room with the cot and the space heater, she wasn't sure if it was protecting her or just keeping her alone in a different way than before. 10 days in, Jake came to her with a problem. "I need a part number from a shipment 3 weeks back," he said, frustration written across every line of his face. "Customer's about to walk, says if we can't confirm the part's original, he's taking his business to the shop on Camelback." Claire didn't even look up from what she was doing. "Which customer?" "Guy named Reyes, restoring an old Bronco." She was already moving toward the filing cabinet before Jake finished the sentence. "You cataloged the March shipments?" he asked, surprised. "I cataloged everything." She pulled a folder, flipping through it with the speed of someone who'd spent every night for a week and a half memorizing a system nobody else had bothered to build. "Here, shipment from March 14th. Part number matches the original manufacturer spec, not aftermarket. You can show him the invoice, it proves the part's authentic." Jake stared at the paper in his hands like it was a small miracle. "You just saved us a $4,000 restoration job," he said slowly. "I know. How did you even—" "I told you, I cataloged everything." Jake looked at her for a long moment, something rearranging behind his eyes, the same recalculation from the closet, but bigger this time, more permanent. "Hey," he said, quieter now. "I was wrong about you. The Friday thing. I told the guys you wouldn't last." Claire almost smiled. "I heard." "Yeah, well," Jake scratched the back of his neck. "I'm not usually wrong about people that fast. Everybody's wrong about somebody eventually." Jake nodded slowly, like that landed somewhere he hadn't expected it to. He left with the invoice and the customer stayed, and by evening the story had already made its way through the yard, the new girl, the closet nobody wanted to touch, the $4,000 save on her 10th day. Dylan heard it secondhand from Preacher, who almost never spoke, which made him listen twice as hard when he did. "She's good," Preacher said, simply wiping grease off his hands with a pro. "Better than good." Dylan looked out through the office window at Claire hunched over a ledger, hair falling out of a hastily tied knot, completely unaware anyone was watching her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I noticed." But it wasn't just her competence that stayed with him. It was the way she flinched and almost invisibly every time a black SUV drove past the front of the property on the main road, even when it had nothing to do with the yard, even when it kept driving, even when there was no reason at all for the reaction. It was the way she never talked about her life before Black Ridge, not once, not even in passing, not even when the other guys traded stories about their past like currency. It was the way she'd asked him on her third day almost casually whether the yard kept records of who came and went through the front gate. Dylan hadn't asked why. He had a feeling the answer to that question was something Claire wasn't ready to say out loud yet, and he'd learned a long time ago that some doors you don't force open. You just make sure the person on the other side knows you'll be standing there when they're ready. 2 weeks into the job, everything changed on a Tuesday that started like any other. Claire had come in early the way she always did now, and was halfway through the morning invoices when she overheard something through the thin office wall that made her pen stop moving entirely. Dylan's voice low tense talking to Preacher in the garage bay just outside. "Another letter from the city," Dylan was saying. "Third one this month. They're calling it a zoning review. It's not a zoning review. Somebody wants this land, and they're using the city to squeeze us off it." "Same developer as last time?" Preacher asked. "Same company, different name on the letterhead every time, but it's the same money behind it. Some group out of Scottsdale, Vance Capital Holdings." Claire's whole body went cold. She knew that name. She'd seen it, not on a letterhead, not in a business article, but in a private conversation 2 years ago. In her old apartment, Marcus on the phone late at night, thinking she was asleep, saying the word Vance. Like it was a partnership he was proud of laughing about, cleaning up small properties before anyone notices what they're worth. She hadn't understood it then. She was starting to understand it now. Her hands were shaking again when she picked her pen back up, not from fear this time, but from something colder, something closer to recognition. The sick feeling of two separate lives suddenly touching at the edges when she'd been so sure she'd left one of them behind for good. She told herself it was a coincidence. She told herself there were 100 companies with names like Vance, 100 developers squeezing small properties in Arizona. No reason at all to believe this one had anything to do with the man she'd spent 2 years trying to disappear from. But that night alone in her small room, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision she wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone yet. She was going to find out, quietly, carefully, without telling Dylan why she suddenly wanted to see every letter the city had sent, every filing connected to Vance Capital Holdings, every piece of paperwork that might confirm or destroy the fear sitting in her chest like a stone. Because if she was right, if the man circling this scrapyard, threatening the only place that had ever handed her a set of keys instead of a set of rules, was connected in any way to Marcus Hale, then the life she thought she'd escaped hadn't let go of her at all. It had just been waiting to find her again. The next morning, she asked Dylan a question she'd been rehearsing all night, trying to make it sound casual, trying to make her voice do something other than shake. "Those letters from the city," she said, setting a cup of coffee on his desk like it was nothing, like her whole body wasn't wound tight as wire. "About the zoning review. Do you still have them?" Dylan looked up slowly. "Why, Usam?" "Because if someone's trying to take this place through paperwork," Claire said, and this time her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "Then paperwork is exactly how we stop them." Dylan studied her for a long moment, the same look he'd given her that first day at the gate, reading something underneath the words she was actually saying. Then he reached into a drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and set it in front of her. "Everything's in here," he said. "Nobody's been able to make sense of it. Lawyers cost money we don't have to burn on a fishing expedition." Claire opened the folder. The first letterhead she saw made her stomach drop straight through the floor. Vance Capital Holdings Attention Acquisitions Division. And beneath it in small print, she almost missed a secondary contact line she recognized instantly, a name that had signed 100 documents she'd once been forced to co-sign without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. Legal counsel Marcus Hale Esquire. Claire didn't move for a long moment. Dylan noticed. "Claire," he said, quieter now, all the roughness gone out of his voice. "What is it?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd walked through that gate 3 weeks ago, she let him see exactly how frightened she really was. "I think," she said slowly, "the man trying to take your scrapyard is the same man I spent 2 years trying to escape." The office went completely silent. Outside the yard kept running engines, radios, the ordinary noise of an ordinary day that had just, without anyone else knowing it, yet stopped being ordinary at all. Dylan closed the folder slowly, his jaw tightening in a way Claire hadn't seen before. Something hardening behind his eyes that had nothing to do with anger at her, and everything to do with the man whose name was sitting on that page. "Tell me everything," he said. And for the first time since she'd walked through those rusted gates with $42 and a broken suitcase wheel, Claire Whitmore opened her mouth and started telling the truth. Dylan didn't say a word for a long moment after Claire finished talking. He sat behind his desk with the folder still open in front of him, one hand flat against the page like he needed something solid to hold on to while his mind caught up with what he'd just heard. The engagement that had started as something that looked like love and ended as something closer to a cage. The paperwork Marcus had made her sign without ever letting her read it properly. The way he'd controlled her accounts, her friendships, even the medication she took for anxiety, he'd convinced her she needed because he'd convinced her something was wrong with her. 2 years, Dylan said, finally, his voice low-controlled in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have. 2 years he did that to you. Almost 3 if you count the engagement. And now he's coming after this yard. Claire nodded, her hands wrapped so tightly around her coffee cup that her knuckles had gone pale. I don't think it's a coincidence, Dylan. I think he tracked me here. Through what? I don't know yet. Maybe an old friend. Maybe he had someone watching my accounts. He always knew things he shouldn't have known. It used to feel like magic. Now I understand it was just money buying information. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd started talking, something steadier crept into her voice, not confidence exactly, but resolve. But I don't think this is about me anymore. I think this is about the land. Dylan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Explain. Vance Capital Holdings doesn't usually go after small properties, Claire said. I remember him talking about their model, buy distressed land, cheap force out anything that makes it hard to develop, flip it in 18 months for triple the price. He used to brag about it like it was clever instead of cruel. She tapped the folder. This yard sits on 6 acres near the new highway extension. Do you know what that land is worth if the extension goes through? Dylan's eyes narrowed. We got offered $400,000 for it 2 years ago. Turned it down flat. It's probably worth 3 times that now, maybe more. Claire pulled a second letter from the folder, the one with the zoning language buried in dense legal paragraphs nobody had bothered translating. This isn't really a zoning review, Dylan. Look at the language here. They're not asking the city to reclassify the land. They're building a paper trail. Environmental complaints, noise violations, code enforcement issues. Every letter is designed to create a record that makes this place look like a liability the city needs to shut down. So the city forces us out. And Vance Capital buys the land at a fraction of what it's worth because nobody wants to buy a scrapyard mid-litigation. Claire set the letter down. It's not really about the money for Marcus. It never is. It's about proving he can take whatever he decides he wants. Dylan stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the concrete floor. That son of a bitch, he said low and flat, more dangerous than if he'd screamed it. Claire flinched, not from Dylan, but from the memory. The words dragged up 3 years of learning that anger in a man's voice was something to brace against. Dylan saw it. He stopped immediately, both hands raised slightly like he was trying to make himself smaller in the room. Hey, he said gentler now. Not at you. Never at you. I know, Claire said, though her heartbeat took another few seconds to believe it. Dylan sat back down slowly, deliberately giving her space to breathe. Okay, he said. Let's think about this like a problem. Not like a nightmare. A problem. He tapped the folder. You know this man's tactics better than any lawyer we could hire. You said he used paperwork to trap you for years. Can you use paperwork to trap him back? Claire felt something shift in her chest, not fear this time, something closer to purpose. Give me access to everything, she said. Every letter, every filing, every piece of correspondence you've gotten from the city or from Vance Capital in the last year. I know how he builds a case. I watched him do it to me for 2 years. I can find the seams. Dylan studied her for a long moment. You sure you're ready for this? He asked. Because once you start pulling this thread, he's going to notice. And if he finds out you're the one pulling it, he already thinks I am hiding somewhere crying, Claire said. And for the first time, something like anger cut clean through the fear in her voice. He thinks I'm too broken to fight back. That's the only reason he hasn't looked harder for me. The moment I disappeared in his mind, I stopped being a threat. She looked Dylan directly in the eyes. I want him to keep thinking that for as long as possible, she said, because it's the only advantage I have. Dylan almost smiled, a small, sharp thing, more respect than humor. All right, he said, you've got the folder. You've got whatever you need, but you're not doing this alone, well. Dylan's boy, that's not up for debate. he said, standing again, calmer this time. You walked into my yard 3 weeks ago with $42 and a job nobody else wanted. You've saved us more money in 3 weeks than the last accountant saved us in 3 years. You think I'm going to let you fight this by yourself? Claire's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Why does that matter to you? She asked quietly. Why do any of you care what happens to me? Dylan crossed his arms, looked at her for a long moment like the answer was obvious. Because that's what family does, he said. You've been here 3 weeks, and you already act like nobody in your life has ever had your back before. Claire didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice not to break if she tried. By the following morning, word had spread through the yard the way word always did not through any announcement, but through the particular quiet that settled over a group of men who'd all been told the same hard truth at once. Jake found Claire in the office before her coffee had even finished brewing. Dylan told us, he said, leaning against the doorframe, all his usual joking energy gone. About the developer. About your ex. Claire's shoulders tensed automatically. He didn't have to tell everyone. He didn't tell everyone, Jake said. He told the full members. That's different. That's family business. He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck, looking suddenly younger than his 26 years. I'm sorry about what happened to you before this place. You don't have to be sorry. It wasn't your fault. I know. But I was an idiot to you your first week. Made bets on how fast you'd quit. Didn't know you were carrying something like that. Jake shook his head. That's on me. Claire managed a small, tired smile. You didn't know. Still on me, Jake said stubbornly. Then something shifted in his face, something harder. You need anything from any of us you ask. I mean that. Preacher appeared in the doorway behind him, a moment later, silent as always, holding something in his scarred hand. He set it on Claire's desk without a word. It was a small burner phone still in its packaging. What's this? Claire asked. In case you need to make a call, you don't want traced to your name, Preacher said simply. Man like that, you want to be careful what he can find. Claire stared at the phone, then up at Preacher, who was already turning to leave, like the gesture required no further explanation. Thank you, she said softly. Preacher paused at the door, glanced back at her. You did good work in that closet, he said. Nobody else touched it in 2 years. You did it in 1 day. He nodded once like that settled something. That's the kind of person worth protecting. He left before Claire could respond, and she sat there for a long moment, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd almost forgotten what the absence of it felt like. The investigation began in earnest that afternoon. Claire spread every document from the folder across the office floor, sorting them the same way she'd sorted the closet 3 weeks earlier, methodically, patiently looking for the pattern underneath the chaos. Dylan sat across from her, occasionally handing her documents, mostly just watching her work with something like fascination. You're good at this, he said after almost an hour of silence. I had a good teacher, Claire said bitterly. Marcus used to explain his strategies to me like bedtime stories. I think he liked having an audience who couldn't do anything about it. She held up 2 letters, comparing the letterhead font, the phrasing, the signature style. Look at this. These 2 letters are supposedly from different city departments, zoning and code enforcement. But the formatting is identical, same margin errors, same font substitution where a special character didn't render. Meaning somebody wrote both letters on the same template, probably outside City Hall, and had someone inside sign off on them. Claire's eyes lit up with something dangerous. If I can prove that I can prove the entire zoning review is manufactured, not just aggressive, fraudulent. Dylan leaned forward. You think Marcus has someone inside the city? He's had people inside city governments before. That's how he cleared zoning for 2 other projects I know about. He calls them consultants. I used to see the wire transfers. Claire's jaw tightened. I never asked questions back then. I was too busy trying not to give him a reason to be angry with me. Dylan's expression darkened, but he kept his voice controlled. You're not that person anymore. No, Claire said, and for the first time she said it like she believed it completely. I'm not. She kept working late into the evening, cross-referencing dates, spotting inconsistencies, building a timeline that told a very different story than the one printed on official letterhead. Around 8, Jake brought her food. She hadn't asked for a burger from the place down the road. Still warm, and set it on the desk without comment, like it was the most natural thing in the world. You didn't have to do that, Claire said. You didn't eat lunch. Preacher noticed, told me to fix it. Jake shrugged. Wasn't going to argue with Preacher. Claire almost laughed a real one, surprising herself with how easily it came. By midnight, she had 4 confirmed inconsistencies across 7 documents, enough to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of the entire zoning review, but not enough yet to prove it outright. She needed more. She needed access to something she didn't have. And the next morning brought the first real twist. Claire arrived at the office to find Dylan already there, his face pale in a way she hadn't seen before, a newspaper folded on the desk in front of him. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Every instinct in her body braced for bad news. Dylan slid the newspaper toward her without a word. The headline read, "Local salvage yard under scrutiny after safety complaints." Claire's stomach dropped as she read further an article citing anonymous complaints about hazardous waste, unsafe working conditions, and code violations at Blackridge Auto Salvage, quoting an unnamed concerned community member and referencing an ongoing city review. "This is a lie," Claire said, her hands trembling with anger, now instead of fear. "Every word of this is a lie. I've seen your safety records. You're compliant on everything." "Doesn't matter if it's true," Dylan said grimly. "Matters if people believe it. This hits the paper, customers start pulling away. City starts feeling pressure to do something. That's how this works. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make us too toxic to survive long enough to fight back." Claire felt something cold settle over her. "He's moving faster than I expected," she said quietly. "You think he knows you're here, that you're the one digging into this?" "I don't know." Claire's mind raced back through the last 3 weeks, searching for any possible leak, any moment Marcus could have learned where she'd landed. "I haven't contacted anyone from my old life. I haven't used my real accounts. I don't understand how—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her face went white. "What?" Dylan asked immediately. "My car," Claire said slowly. "It's registered under my name. I never changed the registration when I left. If anyone ran a search on my name, motor vehicle records would show my car, and if my car's been photographed anywhere near this address." "Son of a bitch," Dylan muttered. "I need to check something." Claire was already moving, pulling up an old email account on the office computer, one she'd barely used since leaving Marcus, one that still technically existed. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she made herself type in the password. 47 unread messages sat in the inbox. 6 of them were from Marcus. Claire's breath caught as she opened the most recent one dated 4 days earlier. "Claire, I know you're in Phoenix. I know about the scrapyard. This doesn't have to be complicated. Come home and none of this happens. You know I always find you eventually. Why do you keep making this harder than it needs to be?" The office went completely silent. Dylan had read the message over her shoulder, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "He's known where you are," Dylan said, voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Maybe this whole time. He's been watching," Claire whispered. "He's been watching and waiting, and I thought I was safe here. I thought—" "You are safe here," Dylan cut in firm immediate. "Don't you dare let him take that from you too. You're not the same woman who walked through that gate. You've got people around you now who aren't going anywhere." Claire closed her eyes, forcing air into her lungs, forcing her hands to stop shaking. "He's not just after the land anymore," she said quietly. "He's after me. This whole zoning thing, this whole legal pressure campaign, some of it might genuinely be about the property value. But some of it is a message, to me, to prove he can reach me anywhere, that there's no version of my life he can't touch." "Then we make sure he's wrong," Dylan said. Over the next several days, the situation escalated in ways nobody at Blackridge had anticipated. A city inspector showed up unannounced, walking the property with a clipboard, writing notes, asking questions, with the kind of scripted precision that told Claire immediately he'd been sent with a specific outcome already decided. 2 regular customers called to cancel standing orders, citing concerns they couldn't articulate clearly when Jake pressed them for details. And on Thursday afternoon, a process server appeared at the gate with a formal notice. Blackridge Auto Salvage was being cited for 11 code violations, with a mandatory city hearing scheduled in 3 weeks that could result in the yard's operating license being suspended. Dylan called an emergency meeting that evening. Every full member of the chapter gathered in the garage bay, the mood heavier than Claire had felt since she'd arrived. "They're moving faster than I've ever seen a zoning fight move," Dylan told the group standing at the front like a man addressing troops before battle. 11 violations. Half of these are things we fixed 2 years ago. The other half never existed in the first place. So we fight it, Big Marcus said, arms crossed, jaw set. We fight it with what? Tommy asked. A city inspector already walked through here with his mind made up. You think a hearing's going to go different? It will if we can prove the complaints are fabricated, Claire said, stepping forward for the first time in the meeting, feeling every set of eyes shift toward her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Preacher from the back of the room said quietly, "Let her talk." Claire took a breath. "I've spent 4 days going through every document connected to this zoning review," she said. "The formatting inconsistencies I found earlier aren't isolated. I've cross-referenced them against 6 other properties Vance Capital has acquired in the last 3 years. Every single one followed the exact same pattern. Anonymous safety complaints, a sudden zoning review, fabricated code violations, a rushed hearing designed to intimidate the property owner into settling before they can mount a real defense." She held up a folder thick now with weeks of research. "This isn't the first time Marcus Hale has done this. It's a formula, and formulas leave patterns. Patterns can be proven." "You can prove this in front of the city?" Dylan asked. "I can prove enough to raise serious doubt," Claire said. "But I need something I don't have yet, direct evidence connecting Marcus Hale's law firm to whoever inside the city is signing off on these fabricated complaints. Without that, it's suspicious. With it, it's fraud." "How do we get that?" Jake asked. Claire's jaw tightened. "I think I know someone who might have it," she said slowly. "Marcus had an assistant, a woman named Renee. She hated him quietly, carefully, the way you hate someone you're too afraid to actually confront. She saw everything. If anyone kept records, she shouldn't have, just in case it would be her." "You think she'd help you?" Dylan asked. Claire's expression hardened with something that looked almost like hope. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think she's the only person outside this yard who might actually want to see him fall as much as I do." Finding Renee wasn't simple. Claire hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years, hadn't dared risk any contact that Marcus might trace, and had no idea if the woman still worked for him, still lived in the same city, or would even want to be found by someone connected to her former boss's past. But 3 days later, using the burner phone Preacher had given her, and a message crafted so carefully it took Claire almost an hour to write 4 sentences, she sent a single text to the only number she still remembered by heart. "It's Claire. I need to ask you something about Marcus. I understand if you don't want to talk. I just need you to know you were always kind to me and I never forgot it." She didn't expect a response. She got one 17 minutes later. "I wondered when you'd finally leave for good. I'm glad you did. What do you need?" Claire read the message 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. She called the number Renee provided that night, sitting alone in the little room with the space heater humming, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I need to know if Marcus is still working with someone inside Phoenix City government," Claire said after the initial relief of hearing a familiar voice had passed. "Zoning department, code enforcement, anything. He's targeting a property. I think he's using fabricated complaints to force it into foreclosure." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You mean Councilman Briggs?" Renee said finally, her voice tight. Claire's pulse spiked. "Who?" "David Briggs, City Council member, District 4. Marcus has been paying him for 2 years consulting fees, he calls them, funneled through a shell account, so it doesn't look like a bribe. Briggs pushes through zoning favors, quietly kills any complaints filed against Vance Capital properties, and greenlights whatever paperwork Marcus needs signed." Renee's voice dropped lower. "I kept records, Claire. Every wire transfer, every email, every meeting note I ever typed for him. I told myself it was just in case I ever needed to protect myself." Claire's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "Would you send them to me?" she asked. "Would you actually help me use them?" Another long pause. "He ruined 4 years of my life before I finally quit," Renee said quietly. "I watched him do it to you too from the outside, and I never said anything because I was too scared of what he'd do if I did." Her voice hardened. "I'm done being scared of him. Yes, I'll send everything. And Claire, yeah, make him pay for all of it, not just the land." The call ended and Claire sat alone in the dark room for a long time afterwards, staring at the burner phone in her hands, feeling something powerful and unfamiliar settle into her chest. For 2 years, she had been the one hiding. Now, for the first time, she understood she wasn't hiding anymore. She was hunting. The documents arrived 2 days later. Encrypted, sent through a method Renee had clearly thought through carefully. Dozens of files, financial records, email chains, meeting notes, spanning nearly 2 years of quiet corruption between Marcus Hale and Councilman David Briggs. Claire spread it all across the office floor at Black Ridge, Dillon, kneeling beside her. Both of them working late into the night, piecing together a case that was rapidly becoming undeniable. "This is it," Dillon said, finally holding up a wire transfer record dated the same week the first zoning complaint had been filed against Black Ridge. $15,000 routed through a shell company 2 days before Briggs's office opened the review. "There's more," Claire said, pulling another document from the pile, her voice shaking with something between fury and disbelief. "Emails between Marcus and Briggs specifically discussing this property. Discussing you, Dillon." Marcus wrote. She stopped reading the words again to make sure she wasn't imagining them. He wrote, "The club won't fight this the way a normal business would. No lawyers, no PR firm, no resources to push back. Easiest acquisition we'll do all year." Dillon's face went hard as stone. "He thought we'd just roll over," he said quietly. "He thinks bikers don't fight with paperwork," Claire said. "He thinks the only way people like you fight back is with fists, and he's built his entire strategy around exploiting that assumption." "Then he's about to learn something," Dillon said, standing slowly, something dangerous and focused settling into his eyes. "This yard isn't going to fight him with fists." Claire looked up at him. "It's going to fight him with exactly the weapon he thought we didn't have," Dillon finished. Claire almost smiled, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "We need a lawyer who can actually use this," she said. "Someone who won't be intimidated the moment Marcus's name shows up on the other side of the table." "I know someone," Dillon said. "Old friend of the club. Represented 2 of our guys years back pro bono when the city tried something similar to a different chapter up in Flagstaff. She doesn't scare easy." "Call her," Claire said. "Tonight if you can." Dillon was already reaching for his phone when the office door burst open. Jake stood in the doorway breathless, his face pale in a way that made Claire's stomach drop instantly. "You need to see this," Jake said. "Both of you, now." He held up his phone, the screen glowing in the dim office light, displaying a local news alert that had just gone live minutes earlier. "Breaking sources allege Hells Angels own salvage bureau yard linked to stolen vehicle operation." Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's not true," Dillon said immediately, his voice low and dangerous. "That's not remotely true. Every vehicle in this yard is documented, titled, accounted for." "Doesn't matter," Claire said, her voice shaking now, the pattern suddenly horribly clear. "It's the same tactic as before. Doesn't need to be true. Just needs to exist long enough to do damage. He's escalating because he knows we're getting close." "How could he possibly know that?" Jake asked. Claire's blood ran cold as the answer surfaced. "Renee," she whispered. "If he's monitoring her communications the way he monitored mine." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dillon was already moving, already dialing a number, his voice hard and fast as he barked instructions to someone on the other end about pulling every camera log, every visitor record, every possible way information could have leaked out of a yard that had, until 3 weeks ago, been the safest place Claire had ever stood. Claire sat frozen in the chair, staring at the headline glowing on Jake's phone, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that the war she'd started fighting quietly, carefully from behind a desk, covered in paperwork, had just become something far more dangerous. Marcus wasn't just defending his scheme anymore. He was declaring publicly, unmistakably, that he knew exactly where to find her, and he was prepared to burn down everything around her to prove he still could. Dillon hung up the phone, turned to face her, his expression grim. "He's not going to stop with a headline," he said quietly. "I know," Claire said. "You still sure you want to keep fighting this?" Claire looked down at the folder in her lap, 2 years of Marcus's crimes laid out in black and white, waiting for someone brave enough to use them. She thought about the woman who'd walked through that gate with $42, too afraid to even meet Dillon's eyes. She thought about everything she'd built in 3 short weeks, a job of purpose, people who'd handed her keys and burner phones and burgers without asking for anything in return. She thought about Renee somewhere out there, finally brave enough to stop being afraid. "He spent years counting on me being too broken to fight back," Claire said, standing slowly, her voice steady despite everything shaking beneath it. "It's time he found out exactly how wrong he was." Outside, the yard sat quiet under the desert night, motorcycles lined up in rows, engines cold waiting. But inside that small office, something had shifted permanently. A decision made a line crossed a war that had started as a quiet investigation, now roaring fully into the open. Marcus Hale had just made his first mistake. He'd shown his hand too early. And Claire Whitmore, for the first time in longer than she could remember, wasn't running from him anymore. She was coming for him. By morning, the stolen vehicle story had been picked up by two more outlets, each one adding a little more speculation, a little less fact, until the version circulating online barely resembled anything close to the truth. Claire sat in the office watching the comments pile up under the article Jake had pulled up on his phone, her stomach twisting tighter with every scroll. Strangers who had never set foot in this yard calling for it to be shut down. Strangers repeating words like gang and criminal enterprise, like they were facts instead of assumptions dressed up in a headline. "This isn't going away on its own," she said quietly. "No," Dylan agreed, standing behind her, arms crossed, jaw tight. "It's not." The lawyer arrived at 9 sharp, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Diane Castellano. Silver hair pulled back tight, a leather satchel that looked like it had survived more courtroom battles than most attorneys saw in a lifetime. She shook Dylan's hand like an old friend, which Claire realized she was. "Been a long time, Razor," Diane said. "Wish it was under better circumstances." "It's never under better circumstances with you boys." She turned to Claire, extending a hand. "You must be the one who found all this." "Claire Whitmore." "Diane Castellano, I've spent 20 years taking apart men exactly like the one you're describing." Diane's eyes were sharp, assessing, not unkind. "Dylan tells me you used to be engaged to him." Claire's throat tightened. "Yes." "That's going to matter," Diane said, not unkindly, sitting down and pulling the folder toward her. "Not as a weakness, as a weapon if we use it right. You know how he operates from the inside. That's not something any outside investigator could ever give me." Claire nodded slowly, some of the shame she'd carried for 2 years shifting almost imperceptibly into something closer to purpose. Diane spent the next 2 hours going through every document, the wire transfers, the emails between Marcus and Councilman Briggs, the fabricated code violations, the pattern across 6 other properties. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "This isn't just zoning fraud," she said slowly. "This is bribery of a public official, wire fraud, and depending on what else we find, probably a RICO case waiting to happen if we can establish it as an ongoing pattern rather than an isolated incident." She looked at Dylan. "You understand what this means?" "Means we might actually win." "Means we might do more than win," Diane said. "Means we might take down Vance Capital Holdings entirely and take Marcus Hale's law license with it." She tapped at the folder. "But I need this Renee to testify. Documents alone can be challenged as stolen or falsified. A witness with first-hand knowledge changes everything." Claire's stomach dropped. She already risked everything sending me this, asking her to testify publicly. "I know it's a big ask," Diane said gently. "But without her, we've got a strong story and a weak case. With her, we've got Marcus Hale finished." Claire pulled out the burner phone that afternoon, her hands unsteady, as she typed the message, knowing exactly what she was asking Renee to risk. "I need to ask you something bigger than before. A lawyer wants you to testify. I understand completely if the answer is no. You've already given me more than I had any right to ask for." The response came almost an hour later. Longer this time, more deliberate. "I've been afraid of that man for 4 years. I watched him break you, and I did nothing because I was terrified of what he'd do to me. I'm done being that person. Tell your lawyer yes. Tell her I'll testify to everything." Claire read the message 3 times, feeling tears sting at the corners of her eyes, not from fear this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. She showed it to Dylan, who read it over her shoulder and let out a slow breath. "That's a brave woman," he said. "She's terrified. I can feel it in every word she writes." "Brave doesn't mean not scared," Dylan said. "It means doing it anyway." Claire looked up at him, something in his words landing somewhere deep, somewhere that had been closed off for a long time. "You'd know something about that," she said quietly. Dylan almost smiled. "Learning." The mini victory didn't last long. 2 days later, Jake burst into the office again, this time, holding not a phone but a printed letter, his face white. "Customer just handed me this," he said. "Guy who's been bringing us his fleet trucks for 6 years. Said his insurance company is dropping his coverage for using an unstable, legally compromised vendor." Jake's hands were shaking with anger. He didn't want to leave Claire. He was crying when he told me. 6 years, and he's terrified his own business is going to get dragged into whatever this is. Claire took the letter, scanning it quickly, recognizing the pattern immediately. "He's not just attacking us anymore," she said. "He's attacking anyone who does business with us." He's isolating the yard the same way he isolated me, cut off every connection, every source of support, until there's nothing left but dependency on him. So what do we do? Jake asked. We move faster than he expects, Claire said, already reaching for her laptop. Diane needs everything today, not next week. If he's escalating this fast, we don't have the luxury of a slow, careful case anymore. She called Diane immediately, relaying the new development, her voice tight with urgency. He's trying to bankrupt us before the hearing even happens, Dylan said, pacing now, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Doesn't matter if we win in 3 weeks, if there's no yard left standing by then. There's another option, Diane said through the phone, her voice calm, calculating. We go public first. Before the hearing, we get ahead of the narrative instead of reacting to it. How? Claire asked. A reporter I trust. Someone who actually checks facts instead of running whatever sounds most sensational. We give her the real story, the bribery, the fabricated complaints, the pattern across multiple properties. We let the truth outrun the lie for once. Claire looked at Dylan, who nodded slowly. Do it, he said. The reporter's name was Angela Cho, and she arrived at the yard the following afternoon with a notebook, a recorder, and an expression that told Claire immediately this was someone who'd heard 1,000 desperate stories and learned to separate the real ones from the performances. Walk me through it, Angela said, sitting across from Claire in the small office. All of it, from the beginning. Claire hesitated only a moment before she started talking. The engagement, the control, the 2 years of slowly losing herself. The scrapyard job nobody else wanted, the folder of documents that had connected her old life to her new one in the worst possible way. Angela didn't interrupt once. She just listened, her pen moving steadily across the notebook, her expression unreadable, until Claire finished. This is a hell of a story, Angela said finally. But a story alone doesn't beat a man with Marcus Hale's resources. I need the documents. I need Renee on record. You'll have both, Diane said, sitting in on the interview, arms crossed. But I want editorial control over how this woman's history is portrayed. She's not a victim in this story. She's the reason this case exists at all. Angela nodded slowly. Understood. The article went up 3 days later, under a headline that made Claire's chest tighten the moment she saw it. Former fiancé of prominent Phoenix attorney exposes alleged bribery scheme targeting local business. It was thorough. It was careful. It laid out the pattern across 6 properties, the wire transfers to Councilman Briggs, the fabricated complaints, all cross-referenced and verified, all attributed properly, all impossible to dismiss as rumor. Within hours, it had been picked up by 3 other outlets. Within a day, Councilman Briggs had issued a terse no comment through a spokesperson, which, according to Diane, was as good as a confession in the court of public opinion. Within 2 days, the tide at Black Ridge had visibly shifted, customers calling not to cancel, but to express support, several even bringing extra work as a show of solidarity. Claire sat in the office that evening, scrolling through the comments beneath the article, watching public sentiment do something she never could have predicted 3 weeks earlier. People are on our side, she said quietly, almost disbelieving. People were always going to be on the side of whoever told the truth loudest, Dylan said, leaning in the doorway. You just made sure that was us. Claire looked up at him. You know this isn't over. He's not going to just walk away from 3 years of planning because of one newspaper article. No, Dylan agreed. He's going to do something worse, probably something desperate. Claire's stomach tightened, some instinct she'd learned to trust during 2 years with Marcus flaring hot and certain. He's going to come here, she said. In person? Dylan's expression hardened. Let him. Oh, no. The next several days passed in a strange, tense quiet, the kind that comes right before a storm makes landfall, when everyone can feel the pressure dropping, but nobody knows exactly when it will break. Diane filed formal complaints with the state bar in the district attorney's office building, the legal case methodically while public pressure mounted around Marcus and Briggs. Renee agreed to a recorded deposition, her voice steady and precise, as she detailed 4 years of watching Marcus manipulate zoning boards, intimidate business owners, and bury anyone who threatened his plans under mountains of predatory paperwork. Claire listened to a portion of that recording with Dylan one evening, both of them silent as Renee's voice filled the small office. He used to say paperwork was the only weapon that never left fingerprints, Renee's recorded voice said. He was proud of that. Proud that he never had to raise his voice or his hand to destroy someone. Just enough signatures, enough shell companies, enough patient pressure, and eventually people just broke. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she listened. Dylan reached over without asking and set his hand gently on her shoulder. Not holding her, not pulling her toward him, just steady present there. You didn't break, he said quietly. You bent, maybe. Everybody bends under enough pressure. But you didn't break. And now you're the reason he's about to lose everything. Claire let the words settle into her feelings, something inside her chest that had been clenched tight for years, finally slowly begin to loosen. The recording ended, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Thank you, Claire said finally. For what? For not looking at me like I'm something broken that needs fixing, she said. Everyone in my old life looked at me that way eventually. Even before Marcus. Like I was something fragile that needed managing. She looked up at him. You've never once looked at me like that. Dylan held her gaze for a long moment. Because you're not fragile, he said simply. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You just spent 2 years being told the opposite by someone who needed you to believe it. Claire felt her eyes sting, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry in front of someone else without immediately apologizing for it. Dylan didn't say anything else. He just stayed there steady present until the moment passed on its own. The twist came 4 days later, and it came from a direction nobody at Black Ridge had anticipated. Claire was cross-referencing shipment logs against customer complaints, old habits, the kind of double-checking she'd never fully been able to shake when she noticed something wrong. A pattern of information that had leaked outside the yard in ways that couldn't be explained by public records alone. Marcus's most recent legal filing referenced specific internal financial details about Black Ridge that had never been made public, numbers from private ledgers, details about cash flow that only existed inside documents Claire herself had organized. Her blood ran cold. Dylan, she said, calling him into the office, her voice tight. Someone's feeding him information from inside the yard. Dylan's face went hard immediately. You sure? These numbers, Claire pointed at the legal filing, then at her own private ledger. These match exactly. This isn't something he could have guessed or reconstructed from public records. Somebody gave him direct access. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, something dark moving behind his eyes. Tommy, he said finally. Claire's stomach twisted. She'd felt something off about Tommy from her very first week. The smile that reminded her too much of the men Marcus used to keep close, the questions he'd occasionally ask that seemed more curious than casual. You think he'd really do that? She asked, even as some part of her had already suspected it for weeks. He's been struggling with money, Dylan said grimly. Gambling debts. I knew about it, figured it was between him and his own conscience. Didn't think he'd sell out the whole yard over it. They confronted Tommy that evening, calling him into the office under the pretense of reviewing inventory numbers. The moment he saw Claire's face in the printed documents laid out on the desk, something shifted in his expression, the easy confidence draining away, replaced by something closer to panic. Dylan, I can explain? Then explain. Dylan said, voice low and dangerous in a way Claire had never heard from him before. Tommy's hands were shaking. He found me 3 weeks ago, said he knew about the debt I owed to some guys downtown, said he could make it disappear if I just kept him updated. Nothing serious, I thought, just information. I didn't think it would actually hurt anybody. You handed him the exact financial vulnerabilities he needed to build his legal case against us. Claire said, her voice steady despite the fury rising in her chest. You didn't think that would hurt anybody? Tommy's face crumpled. I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would get this bad. I thought it was just business information, nothing that could actually cost every man in this yard his livelihood, Dylan said, cutting him off. It could cost Claire her safety. You understand that? Tommy's eyes filled with tears, genuine shame breaking through the panic. What happens now? Dylan looked at him for a long, silent moment. You're out, he said finally. Not just the club. You understand what that means. Tommy nodded slowly, defeated, all the fight gone out of him. One more thing, Dylan said as Tommy turned to leave. You're going to give us everything Marcus asked you for. Every message, every conversation. We're going to use it against him. Tommy paused, something like relief crossing his face, the chance, however small, to make something right. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, okay. He left the phone records and message logs on the desk before he walked out for the last time. And Claire sat there afterward, staring at the evidence of one more betrayal in a story that had already been built on far too many of them. You okay? Dylan asked quietly. I keep thinking I've run out of ways for this to hurt, Claire said, and then it finds one more. Dylan sat down across from her. This is the last one, he said. I promise you that. Whatever information leaked already leaked. From here forward, it's just us finishing what we started. Claire nodded slowly, gathering herself, gathering the evidence Tommy had left behind, adding it to the case Diane was building. The following Tuesday brought the moment Claire had been dreading since the first letter from Vance Capital Holdings had appeared in that folder weeks earlier. She was in the office reviewing final details with Diane over the phone when Jake's voice came through the open door, tight with alarm. Claire, you need to see this. She stepped outside and her entire body went cold. A black SUV was pulling through the front gate, moving slow, deliberate, the kind of arrival designed to be noticed. Claire knew that vehicle. She'd sat in the passenger seat of it 100 times, watched Marcus drive it with the same casual arrogance he carried into every room he ever entered. He's here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dylan appeared beside her almost instantly, his expression shifting into something hard and controlled. Stay behind me, he said. No, Claire said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I need to face him myself. If I hide from him now after everything he wins, something he doesn't deserve to win. Dylan studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we're right beside you. Not in front, beside. The SUV came to a stop in the middle of the yard, and Marcus Hale stepped out wearing an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place among the stripped engines and rusted metal, his expression carrying the same practiced charm Claire remembered from the very beginning of their relationship, the charm that had convinced her once that she was the luckiest woman in the world. She felt nothing now but a cold, clear focus. Claire, Marcus said, his voice warm, familiar, deliberately gentle. You look tired. Are they treating you all right out here? Get off my property before I call the police on you myself. Claire said, her voice cracking only slightly. On the last word, her hands tight around the folder she'd carried outside with her. Marcus's smile flickered, just barely surprised, breaking through the composure for half a second before he smoothed it back over. That's not like you, he said. You've always been so reasonable. I've always been so afraid, Claire corrected. There's a difference. I just didn't understand it until I left. Behind her, Dylan and 3 other members of the club stood in a loose line, arms crossed, saying nothing, needing nothing, not threatening, simply present. Marcus glanced at them, something calculating behind his eyes. I came to talk business, he said, turning back to Claire, his tone shifting towards something more clinical. There are contracts you signed, financial obligations tied to accounts we shared. You can't just walk away from those, Claire, no matter how good it feels to play house out here with your new friends. The contracts are outdated, Claire said, pulling a document from her folder, her hands steadier now than she expected. Voided the moment I filed for the protective separation 8 months ago. My attorney has already confirmed it. You know that. You're just hoping I don't. Marcus's jaw tightened, the first real crack in his composure. You always did like to make things complicated, he said. No, Claire said. You always like to make things complicated. I just finally learned how to read the fine print. For a moment, Marcus said nothing, recalculating, clearly unprepared for the version of Claire standing in front of him now. Then he tried a different approach. This yard is finished either way, he said, his voice hardening. The zoning review, the code violations, the insurance issues, you can delay it, Claire, but you can't stop it. I have people inside the city who... Councilman Briggs, Claire said calmly. Marcus went completely still. We know about the $15,000. Claire continued, watching his face carefully. We know about the shell company. We know about the 6 other properties you've acquired using the exact same pattern of fabricated complaints and manufactured zoning reviews. Renee gave a full deposition 3 days ago. It's already with the district attorney's office. Marcus's face drained of color. You're lying, he said, but his voice had lost every ounce of its earlier confidence. Check your email, Claire said. Diane Castellano sent formal notice to your law firm an hour ago, along with copies of everything to the state bar. She held up the folder, letting him see the thickness of it, the weeks of work it represented. The woman you thought was too broken to fight back just spent 3 weeks building the case that's going to end your career. Marcus stared at her, something unfamiliar flickering behind his eyes. The first real fear Claire had ever seen on his face in all the years she'd known him. You walked in here thinking she had nobody, Dylan said, stepping forward slightly, his voice low and steady. You were wrong. Marcus's eyes shifted toward Dylan, then swept across the line of men standing silently behind Claire, recalculating something behind his composed mask, understanding perhaps for the first time the actual scale of what he'd underestimated. This isn't over, Marcus said. but the words came out thinner than he clearly intended them to. No, Claire agreed. It's not, but it's over for you the way you wanted it to be. You came here expecting a frightened woman with nothing. You're leaving knowing exactly how wrong that was. For a long, tense moment, Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the yard, surrounded by rusted metal and silent men, and the woman he'd once believed he owned completely. Then without another word, he turned, climbed back into the SUV, and drove away. Not with the composed exit he'd probably rehearsed on the way over, but fast, sloppy, the tires kicking gravel behind him, in a way that betrayed exactly how rattled he actually was. The yard stayed silent for a long moment after the SUV disappeared through the gate. Then Jake let out a low whistle. Damn, he said quietly. Claire felt her knees go weak, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation suddenly draining out all at once, leaving her shaking, breathless, overwhelmed. Dylan caught her before she fully realized she was swaying his hand steady on her arm. You did it, he said quietly. You actually did it. Claire looked up at him, tears finally breaking free, not from fear this time, but from something enormous and overwhelming, finally releasing after weeks of carrying it alone. I didn't do it alone, she said. No, Dylan agreed, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. None of us do anything alone. That's kind of the whole point of a family. Around them, the yard slowly returned to its ordinary sounds, engines, radios, the everyday noise of men getting back to work, the crisis for now having passed. But Claire understood, standing there in the dust with her hands still trembling, that Marcus's retreat wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning of his fall, and somewhere out there right now he was almost certainly scrambling to figure out exactly how much damage had already been done and exactly how much more was still coming for him. Marcus didn't call that night. He didn't call the next morning either. The silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it sat heavy in Claire's chest, a familiar weight she'd learned the hard way never to trust. Marcus Hale did not retreat quietly. In 3 years, she had never once seen him accept a loss without trying to reshape it into something else first. He's planning something, she said, standing in the office doorway, watching Dylan review the morning's mail, with the kind of careful attention that had become second nature to both of them since the SUV had pulled through the gate 2 days earlier. Maybe he's just licking his wounds, Jake offered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Men like Marcus don't lick wounds, Claire said. They look for new places to bite. She was right. The call came at 4:47 that afternoon, not from Marcus, but from Diane, her voice tight in a way Claire had never heard from the steady, unshakable attorney. He filed something, Diane said without preamble. This morning, an emergency motion for a psychiatric evaluation claiming you're a danger to yourself and unfit to manage your own affairs. He's citing your, quote, documented history of emotional instability during your relationship. Claire's stomach dropped straight through the floor. He's trying to have me declared incompetent, she said slowly, the horror of it landing in pieces. He's trying to use the very damage he caused as proof that I can't be trusted. That's exactly what he's trying to do, Diane confirmed grimly. It's a desperate move. Legally, it's weak. We have Renee's deposition, we have the financial records, we have everything we need to show a pattern of manipulation rather than genuine instability. But desperate men do desperate things, and I need you to prepare yourself. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. Claire set the phone down slowly after the call ended, her hands shaking in a way she hadn't allowed them to in weeks. Dylan was watching her from across the office, his expression darkening as he read the fear on her face. What did he do? He said. Not a question, a demand, Claire told him. For a long moment, Dylan said nothing at all. He just stood there, jaw-working, hands curling slowly into fists at his sides, something dangerous and controlled moving behind his eyes. He's trying to make you doubt yourself, he said, finally, his voice low. That's the whole play. Doesn't matter if it holds up legally. He just needs you scared enough to stop fighting. It's working, Claire admitted, her voice breaking slightly. For about 30 seconds after Diane told me, some part of me started wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I did imagine half of what happened between us. She wrapped her arms around herself, an old familiar posture, one she'd worked hard to unlearn. That's what 2 years with him did to me, Dylan. Even now, even with all this evidence that's sitting right in front of me, some part of me still hears his voice and believes it. Dylan crossed the room and crouched slightly in front of her chair, meeting her eyes directly, his voice steady and low. Listen to me, he said. That voice isn't yours, it's his. He put it there brick by brick over 2 years because a woman who trusts her own mind is a woman he can't control. That's not a flaw in you, Claire. That's proof of exactly how good he is at what he does. He paused. And you beat him anyway. Every single day since you walked through that gate, you've been fighting a voice he installed in your head, and you've been winning. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time they didn't feel like weakness. They felt like release. I don't know how to make it stop, she whispered, even after everything. You don't make it stop all at once, Dylan said gently. You just keep proving it wrong one day at a time until eventually it gets quieter than the truth standing next to it. The following morning brought the second twist nobody had anticipated. Angela Cho called before Claire had even finished her coffee, her voice tight with urgency. I need you to see something before it goes any further, Angela said. Marcus's people just sent a statement to 3 different outlets, including mine. They're claiming you fabricated the entire bribery narrative as retaliation after he ended the relationship. They're painting you as an unstable ex-partner running a smear campaign. Claire felt the floor tilt again. That's insane, she said. He's the one who ended it. He tried to have me committed after I finally left him. I know, Angela said. And I'm not running his statement without pushback. I've already reached out to Renee for an on-record response, and I'm pulling the deposition transcript to publish alongside anything Marcus's team puts out. But I need you to understand, Claire, this is going to get personal. He's not fighting the facts anymore. He's fighting the narrative. Claire hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not fear this time, but a slow-burning, clarifying anger. He's rewriting history, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. That's what he always did. Every fight we ever had, by the next morning, somehow I was the one who started it. I spent 2 years apologizing for things I never did because he was better at rewriting the story than I was at remembering the truth. Not this time, Dylan said firmly. This time there's a paper trail. This time there's a woman named Renee who watched it happen and finally said so out loud. This time, Claire, you're not the only one telling this story. Claire looked up at him. Something in his certainty steadied her more than she expected. I need to do something, she said, suddenly standing up, her mind already racing ahead. I need to go on record myself, not hiding behind Diane, not letting Angela paraphrase me secondhand. I need people to hear it directly from me. You sure you're ready for that? Dylan asked. Once you are the public face of this, there's no taking that back. Claire thought of the woman who had walked through the gate 3 weeks earlier, unable to meet anyone's eyes, terrified of her own shadow. I've spent 2 years being talked about instead of talked to, she said. It's time I talked back. The interview aired 4 days later, a full unedited sit-down with Angela Cho broadcast alongside the written article that had already started reshaping public opinion across Phoenix. Claire sat in a chair across from Angela's camera crew, her hands folded tightly in her lap, Dylan standing just out of frame where she could see him if she needed to. Tell me about the day you left him, Angela said gently. Claire took a breath. It wasn't one day, she said. That's what people don't understand about relationships like that. It's not a single dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small moments where you convince yourself things are fine until one morning you wake up and realize you don't recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror. Her voice wavered, then steadied. The day I actually left, he'd taken my car keys because he said I was too anxious to drive safely. He'd started controlling my medication 2 months earlier, deciding when I needed it and when I didn't, deciding what my own mind could and couldn't be trusted with. That morning, I realized if I didn't leave immediately, I might never leave at all. And now he's claiming you fabricated the corruption allegations out of revenge, Angela said. Claire's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. I have wire transfer records that predate our breakup by over a year, she said. I have a deposition from his own former assistant who watched him build this scheme from the inside. I have formatting inconsistencies across 7 legal documents that prove fraud independent of anything I personally experienced with him. She looked directly into the camera. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. There's a difference, and I spent 2 years not understanding it. Because he taught me that holding him responsible for anything was the same thing as attacking him. It's not. It never was. The interview ran for 23 minutes, and by the time it aired that evening, something had shifted permanently in the public conversation. Comments poured in not from strangers debating a headline anymore, but from women who recognized pieces of their own stories in Claire's words, sharing their own experiences, offering support Claire had never expected to receive from people she'd never met. Dylan watched her read through them that night, her face lit by the glow of the laptop screen, tears streaming freely now, but different tears than before. You okay? He asked quietly. I thought I was the only one, Claire said, her voice thick. For 2 years, I thought there was something uniquely broken about me that let this happen. Reading all this, she gestured at the screen, the dozens of messages from strangers describing eerily similar patterns of control. I understand now. It was never about me being weak. It was a method, a calculated, repeatable method he probably used before me and would have used again after me. And now, Dylan asked. And now I get to be the reason he doesn't get the chance to use it on anyone else. Claire said something fierce and unshakable settling into her voice. The formal city hearing arrived faster than anyone expected, moved up at Diane's insistence once the fraud allegations against Councilman Briggs became public enough that the city council found itself desperate to distance itself from the entire situation. Claire sat beside Dylan in the front row of the crowded council chamber, her hands cold despite the warm room, watching city officials shuffle papers with the particular nervousness of people who suddenly understood they were standing far closer to a scandal than they'd realized. Diane stood at the podium, calm and methodical, laying out the case piece by piece. The fabricated safety complaints, the manufactured zoning review, the $15,000 wire transfer to a shell company, traced directly back to Councilman Briggs 2 days before the review had opened. This body was used, Diane said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, not to protect this community, but to manufacture a pretext for seizing private property on behalf of a development firm that has run this exact scheme on 6 other properties across this county in the last 3 years. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Councilman Briggs, seated at the front, his face pale and rigid, said nothing. We have wire transfer records, Diane continued. We have sworn deposition testimony from a witness with direct first-hand knowledge of the scheme's operation. We have documentary evidence of identical formatting and language used across multiple fraudulent complaints filed against unrelated properties. This is not a zoning dispute. This is public corruption. The council chamber erupted into whispered conversation, and the chairwoman had to call for order twice before Diane could finish. Claire felt Dylan's hand find hers under the table, steady grounding, and she held onto it without a second thought, without the old instinct to pull away and hide her need for comfort. When the vote came, it wasn't close. The zoning review against Black Ridge Auto Salvage was dismissed unanimously, all 11 code violations struck from the record as unsubstantiated, and the council formally referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. The chamber broke into scattered applause, and Claire sat frozen for a moment, unable to fully process that it was actually over, that the paperwork designed to destroy everything Dylan had built, everything she'd found refuge in, had just been dismantled in a public room by the exact tool Marcus had believed would always be his alone. We won, Jake said, disbelief written across his face as he leaned over from the row behind them. We won, Claire repeated softly, like she needed to say it out loud to believe it was real. But the moment of celebration didn't last as long as she expected. Outside the council chamber in the parking lot, Claire's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Congratulations. You won this round. But you should know I filed for a restraining order against you claiming harassment and stalking behavior stemming from your obsessive pursuit of information about my personal and business affairs. My attorney will be in touch. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Claire's hands went cold as she read it, the temporary relief of the hearing evaporating instantly. What is it? Dylan asked, noticing the shift in her face immediately. She showed him the message silently. Dylan's jaw tightened as he read it. He's still swinging. He's not going to stop, Claire said quietly. Even losing this badly, even with the DA involved, now he's still trying to find some way to make me the villain of this story. Let him try, Diane said, appearing beside them with her briefcase in hand, having caught the tail end of the conversation. A restraining order claim built entirely on retaliation after a public corruption exposure is going to look exactly like what it is, a last desperate attempt to muddy the water. Judges see through that faster than you'd think. But it'll still cost time, Claire said. Still cost money, still keep this hanging over everyone at the yard even after we've already won the actual case. Maybe, Diane admitted, but Claire, look at what you've already accomplished. Councilman Briggs is facing a criminal referral. The city council just publicly dismantled every allegation against Black Ridge. Marcus Hale's own law firm has already issued a statement distancing itself from his personal conduct, pending an internal review. He's not winning anything anymore. He's just making noise on his way down. Claire wanted to believe her. Some small, exhausted part of her still braced for the next blow, the way 2 years of living with Marcus had trained her to always expect one more. That blow, when it came 3 days later, wasn't legal. It was personal, and it came in a way none of them had anticipated. Claire was in the office finishing end-of-month invoices when Preacher appeared in the doorway, his weathered face unusually tense. "You need to come outside," he said quietly. "Now." Claire's stomach dropped as she followed him out into the yard where a small crowd of workers had gathered near the front gate, all of them staring at something with expressions somewhere between confusion and alarm. A woman stood at the gate, mid-40s, expensive coat, designer sunglasses pushed up into perfectly styled hair, looking as out of place in the scrapyard as Marcus had weeks earlier. "Can I help you?" Dylan asked, stepping forward, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm looking for Claire Whitmore," the woman said, her voice clipped, controlled. "My name is Patricia Hale. I'm Marcus's mother." Claire felt her whole body go rigid. She had met Patricia Hale exactly twice during her engagement to Marcus, both times brief, both times leaving Claire with the distinct impression that she was being evaluated and found wanting, though she'd never been able to articulate exactly why. "I'm Claire," she said, stepping forward, despite every instinct telling her to disappear back into the office instead. Patricia studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind her expression. "I read the article," she said finally, "and I watched your interview. 3 times, actually." She paused, and something in her composed face cracked slightly. "I need you to know something, and I need you to know it away from cameras, away from lawyers, just from me to you." "What is it?" Claire asked carefully. Dylan tensing beside her, clearly ready to intervene if this conversation turned in any direction resembling a threat. "Marcus's father did the same thing to me," Patricia said quietly. 30 years ago. Different methods. This was before cell phones, before the kind of digital control he's built his whole life around, but the same pattern. Control disguised as love. Isolation disguised as protection. Her voice wavered slightly. "I stayed for 11 years before I finally left. I told myself for 11 years that I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive, too unstable, exactly the words Marcus used against you." Claire stood frozen, unable to fully process what she was hearing. "I watched my son become his father." Patricia continued, her composed exterior finally giving way to something raw and grieving. "I told myself it wasn't happening. I told myself I was wrong because admitting it meant admitting I'd failed to protect him from becoming exactly what nearly destroyed me." She took a shaking breath. "I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because I owe you an apology. I should have given the very first time I met you, back when I saw the same look in your eyes that I used to see in my own mirror, and I said nothing." Claire's eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked softly. "Because I'm done being silent," Patricia said. "I'm done protecting a pattern that's already hurt too many women, including myself. I've given a statement to your attorney's office this morning. Everything I witnessed during your relationship, everything I know about his father's behavior and how closely Marcus modeled himself after it." She reached into her coat and pulled out a business card, holding it out with a hand that trembled slightly. "If you need anything else from me, anything, you call that number." Claire took the card slowly, her fingers numb. "Thank you," she whispered. Patricia nodded, once her composure fully returning, though something in her eyes remained soft, almost pleading. "You're stronger than I ever managed to be," she said. "Don't let him convince you otherwise. Not now, not ever." She turned and walked back to her car without another word, leaving Claire standing frozen in the yard, the business card clutched tightly in her hand, Dylan watching her carefully from a few feet away. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Claire looked down at the card, then up at him, something enormous shifting inside her chest. "He learned this from somewhere," she said slowly. "I always wondered how someone becomes what Marcus became. Now I understand, it's not random. It's inherited unless somebody finally breaks the pattern." She looked back toward the gate, toward the empty space where Patricia's car had been. "She just handed us the final piece Diane needed, a pattern spanning 2 generations. That's not just corruption anymore, Dylan. That's a documented history of abuse used to build financial power. No judge is going to look at that and see anything except exactly what it is." Fastu. The restraining order hearing took place 8 days later, and Diane walked in with Patricia Hale's sworn statement in hand, along with everything else they'd already assembled. Marcus's attorney, a younger man who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the hearing progressed, tried repeatedly to characterize Claire's actions as targeted harassment, a calculated campaign of revenge following a difficult breakup. Diane dismantled the argument methodically, piece by piece, presenting the timeline of events in careful, undeniable order. The wire transfers predating the breakup by over a year. Renee's testimony describing a pattern established long before Claire had ever left. And finally, Patricia Hale's own statement describing 3 decades of watching the same pattern repeat across 2 generations of men in the same family. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who had clearly seen more than her share of manipulative filings over the years, did not take long to reach her decision. "This request for a restraining order is denied," she said, her voice flat and final. "Furthermore, given the pattern of retaliatory legal action described in these proceedings, I am referring this matter to the State Bar for review of Mr. Hale's conduct as an officer of the court." Marcus sat frozen at the defense table, his face draining of color for the second time in a month, the full weight of what was happening finally settling over him in a room he could no longer control. Claire watched him from across the courtroom, waiting for the flood of relief she expected to feel. Instead, what she felt was something quieter, something like closure settling slowly into place after weeks of waiting for it to arrive. Outside the courthouse, Diane turned to her with something that, for the first time since Claire had met her, looked almost like genuine warmth. "It's over," Diane said. "The bribery case is moving forward with the DA. Briggs resigned this morning, effective immediately. Marcus's firm terminated him as senior partner 2 hours ago. I got the notification right before we walked in here. The State Bar review alone could end his ability to practice law in this state permanently." Claire stood on the courthouse steps, sunlight bright overhead, feeling the words slowly sink in. "It's actually over," she repeated softly. "The legal side, yes," Diane said. "The rest of it—" She paused, studying Claire carefully. "That takes longer, but you've already done more of that work than most people manage in years of therapy. I've watched you do it piece by piece since the first day you walked into my office." Dylan stood a few feet away, giving them space, watching Claire with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pride maybe, or something warmer than pride, something he hadn't let himself say out loud yet. Claire walked over to him, slowly, still holding the weight of everything that had just happened. "We did it?" she said. "You did it," Dylan corrected gently. "We just made sure you didn't have to do it alone." Claire looked up at him, something shifting in the space between them that neither of them acknowledged directly, not yet. Not with everything still so raw. "Take me home," she said quietly. Dylan's expression softened. The yard? Claire thought about the little room with the coat and the space heater, the office where she'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding not just a filing system, but an entire life. "Yeah," she said, something steady and certain in her voice for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Home." They drove back to Black Ridge in comfortable silence, and when they pulled through the gate, every member of the club was waiting in the yard, having heard the news already through Preacher, who'd been on the phone with Diane's office the entire time. Jake let out a whoop the moment Claire stepped out of the truck, and within seconds, she found herself surrounded by the same men who'd bet against her lasting past Friday 6 weeks earlier. All of them grinning and several of them hugging her without hesitation, the entire yard filled with a kind of relief and celebration that felt to Claire like nothing she had ever experienced before. "You did it," Jake said, pulling back from a brief, fierce hug. "You actually took him down." "We did it," Claire corrected, echoing Dylan's words back at him, meaning it completely. Preacher approached last, his weathered face unusually open with emotion. "Told you," he said simply. "That first day in that closet. Told you that was the kind of person worth protecting." He nodded once satisfied. "Glad I was right." Claire felt tears rising again, but this time surrounded by the people who had become somehow without her. Fully realizing when it happened, her family, she let them fall freely without shame, without apology. The sun was beginning to set over the yard, casting long shadows across the mountains of scrap metal that had once seemed so intimidating and now felt more than any place she'd ever lived entirely her own. Dylan stood a little apart from the celebration, watching her with the same careful attention he'd shown her from the very first day when she'd walked through that gate with $42 and nowhere left to go. He didn't say anything else that evening. He didn't need to. But as the celebration wound down and the yard slowly quieted under the darkening sky, Claire caught him watching her one more time, and something passed between them, unspoken, unhurried, but unmistakably real. Whatever came next, she understood, standing there in the fading light, she would not be facing it alone. She had spent 2 years believing she needed someone else to make her whole. She was only now beginning to understand that the woman standing in this yard, scarred and rebuilt, and finally fully her own person, had never actually been broken at all. She had simply been waiting for the right place to remember who she really was. The weeks after the restraining order hearing didn't feel like the ending Claire had imagined. She'd pictured somewhere in the exhausted corners of her mind, during the worst nights of the fight, a single dramatic moment where everything simply stopped, where Marcus disappeared from her life, the way a bad dream disappears the second you open your eyes. Instead, the ending arrived slowly in pieces, each one demanding something from her before it would let her rest. The first piece came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the hearing, when Diane called with news that made Claire's stomach clench even before she'd finished pouring her coffee. Marcus is appealing the state bar's preliminary findings, Diane said. He's hired new counsel out of Los Angeles. Aggressive firm. They're arguing procedural irregularities in how the complaint was filed. Claire sat down slowly at the small table in the office, feeling the familiar cold spread through her chest. He's not done, she said. No, Diane admitted. Men like Marcus rarely accept an ending gracefully. But Claire, I want you to hear the rest of what I'm about to say because it matters. Procedural appeals almost never overturn factual findings. He's not disputing the evidence anymore. He's disputing paperwork. That's a man out of real arguments grasping for anything that buys him time. Time for what? Time to figure out how to survive what's already been proven, Diane said simply. Claire closed her eyes, breathing through the tightness in her chest, the way she'd learned to over the last 2 months, not fighting the fear, just letting it pass through her instead of settling in. What do you need from me, she asked. Nothing yet, Diane said. Just stay steady. This part isn't yours to fight, it's mine. Claire hung up the phone and sat alone in the quiet office for a long moment, staring at the ledger she'd built from nothing, the filing system that ran the yard now, with a precision it had never known before her. She thought about how far she'd come from the woman who used to flinch at every unexpected phone call. She still flinched sometimes. But now the flinch passed in seconds instead of settling into her bones for days. Dylan found her there 20 minutes later, still sitting at the desk, her coffee gone cold beside her. Diane called, he said. It wasn't a question. He's appealing, Claire said. New lawyers, trying to argue his way out of the bar complaint. Dylan leaned against the doorframe arms, studying her face carefully the way he always did now, reading her the way he'd learned to read engines and paperwork and men who lied about what they needed. You scared? He asked. Claire thought about the question honestly before she answered it. A little, she admitted, but it's different now. It used to feel like standing in front of a wave, waiting to get pulled under. Now it feels more like standing on solid ground, watching a wave that can't actually reach me anymore. She looked up at him. Does that make sense? Makes perfect sense, Dylan said. That's what it looks like when somebody stops being a victim and starts being a witness to their own life instead. Claire felt something warm move through her chest at the words, not relief. Exactly something steadier than relief. You always know exactly what to say, she said. Well, always, Dylan said, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Ask Preacher how many times I've said the wrong thing to somebody in this yard. Claire laughed a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind she hadn't been able to produce for most of the last 3 years. The sound seemed to catch Dylan off guard. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing behind his eyes before he cleared his throat and pushed off the doorframe. Come on, he said. Big Marcus needs help logging an engine shipment, and you're the only one who can read his handwriting. Claire stood grateful for the excuse to move to work, to feel useful in the ordinary way that had slowly become the foundation of her new life. The appeal dragged on for 6 more weeks, and during that time, Blackridge Auto Salvage did something nobody, least of all Claire, had expected. It thrived. The publicity from the corruption case, painful and invasive as it had been, had turned the yard into something of a local landmark. Customers who'd never have considered a scrapyard run by Hell's Angels now specifically sought them out, drawn by a story of a woman who'd found refuge in an unlikely place and a group of bikers who'd stood by her when it mattered most. Jake, who'd taken on informal responsibility for customer relations somewhere in the chaos of the last few months, started keeping a running tally of new accounts on a whiteboard in the garage, updating it with visible pride every time a new customer signed on. We're up 40% from this time last year, he announced one afternoon, tapping the whiteboard with something like triumph. 40%, Claire. You know how insane that is for a scrapyard. I know exactly how insane it is, Claire said, not looking up from the account she was reconciling. I did the math 3 days ago. Jake grinned. Of course you did. Dylan watched the exchange from across the garage, something settled and content in his expression that hadn't been there during Claire's first weeks at the yard back when every day carried an undercurrent of uncertainty about whether Black Ridge would survive its next crisis. He walked over to where Claire sat, sliding a folder onto the desk in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "Insurance renewal paperwork," Dylan said. "Figured you'd want first look before I sign off on anything." Claire opened the folder, scanning the numbers quickly, a habit so ingrained now it barely required conscious thought. "This premium's higher than it should be," she said after a moment. "Given our safety record over the last 6 months, we should be negotiating a discount, not accepting a standard renewal rate." "You want to call them?" "I want to renegotiate the whole policy," Claire said, already reaching for the phone. "Give me 20 minutes. Dylan watched her work, quick, confident, completely in her element, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't fully let himself name yet. 19 minutes later, Claire hung up the phone with a satisfied expression. "Saved us $600 a month," she said, "and got them to add coverage for the new equipment bay you have been wanting to build." Dylan stared at her for a long moment. "You just paid for 6 months of your own salary in one phone call," he said finally. "I told you the first day." Claire said something proud and unguarded in her voice now. "I wasn't looking for an easy job. I was looking for a chance." "Best decision I ever made giving you that chance," Dylan said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had probably intended. Claire looked up at him, something shifting in the small space between them. Something that had been building slowly for months, unacknowledged, patient. Neither of them said anything else about it, but neither of them looked away either. The final resolution arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, nearly 5 months after Claire had first walked through the gates of Black Ridge with $42 and a broken suitcase wheel. Diane called with a tone in her voice that told Claire immediately this was the call they'd all been waiting for. "It's over," Diane said. The state bar upheld the original findings. Marcus Hale's license to practice law in Arizona has been permanently revoked, effective immediately. The appeal exhausted his last option. Claire sat frozen for a moment, the words taking time to fully register. "And the criminal case?" she asked. "Councilman Briggs pled guilty to bribery charges this morning as part of a plea agreement," Diane continued. "Part of that agreement requires his full cooperation in the ongoing investigation into Vance Capital Holdings. The DA's office confirmed to me an hour ago that Marcus is now facing formal charges for wire fraud and bribery of a public official. His arraignment is scheduled for next month." Claire's hands were shaking, but this time the shaking felt like something settling into place rather than something breaking apart. "He's actually facing prison time," she said slowly. "Significant prison time if convicted," Diane confirmed. And Claire, the financial records also revealed something else. Vance Capital Holdings has been quietly ordered to reverse 3 of the fraudulent property acquisitions uncovered during the investigation, including 2 family-owned businesses that had already been forced to close. "Your case didn't just save this yard. It's giving people their livelihoods back." Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears rising fast and unexpected. "I need to go tell Dylan," she said, her voice thick. "Go," Diane said gently. "You've earned this moment." Claire found Dylan in the garage bay, elbow deep in an engine repair, Jake beside him, passing tools with the easy rhythm of men who'd worked together for years. "Dylan," Claire said, and something in her voice made him straighten, immediately wiping his hands on a rag, searching her face for a signal of good news or bad. "What happened?" he asked. "It's over," Claire said, the words breaking apart into something between a laugh and a sob. "Really over. His license is gone. Briggs pled guilty. Marcus is facing criminal charges. Real ones. Prison Dylan. He might actually go to prison." For a moment, Dylan didn't move at all, absorbing the words. Then slowly a smile broke across his weathered face, full, unguarded, the kind of smile Claire had only glimpsed in small pieces over the last 5 months. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Claire corrected the way she always did now. Jake let out a whoop that echoed through the garage bay, and within seconds, every man in the yard had gathered, words spreading fast through the small crowd, the celebration building with a kind of joyful chaos that Claire had never experienced anywhere else in her life. Preacher approached quietly amid the noise, his weathered hand resting briefly on Claire's shoulder. "Man tried to convince the whole world you were broken," he said. "Ended up proving to the whole world exactly how strong you really are instead." He nodded once, satisfied in the way that was uniquely his own. "Funny how that works out sometimes." Claire felt tears streaming freely now, surrounded by the noise and warmth of a family she never could have imagined finding in a scrapyard 6 months earlier. That evening, after the celebration had settled into something quieter, Claire found herself alone in the office staring at the ledger she'd built from nothing, the numbers that told the story of everything she'd rebuilt. Dylan appeared in the doorway, 2 beers in hand, offering her one silently. She took it, and for a while they sat together in comfortable silence, the yard quiet outside the window, motorcycles lined up under the darkening sky. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said finally. "Anything." "That first day," she said slowly, "when I walked through the gate, what made you actually give me the green? Everyone else had already turned me away before I even got to you." Dylan considered the question for a long moment, turning the beer bottle slowly in his hands. "You looked exactly like I did 20 years ago," he said finally, standing in front of somebody terrified out of options but too proud to fully let it show. "I recognized it because I'd lived it. This club, every man in this yard, we all came from somewhere that spit us out before this place took us in. When I saw you standing there, I didn't see a woman who didn't belong. I saw somebody who needed exactly what this place gave me once." Claire's eyes filled again, but this time she let the tears fall without embarrassment, without apology. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "You know that, right? Not just the everything after. The room, the burner phone from Preacher. The way every single one of you stood behind me without asking for anything in return." "You saved this place right back," Dylan said. "Don't forget that part. We were about to lose everything to that man before you walked in here and figured out exactly how to stop him." "Maybe we saved each other," Claire said softly. Dylan looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression finally settling into certainty. "Claire," he said, his voice quieter, now more careful than she'd ever heard it. "I need to say something, and I need you to know there's no pressure attached to it. Whatever you're ready for, whatever you're not ready for, that's fine. I just don't want to keep sitting on it." Claire's heart began pounding, some instinct telling her exactly what was coming. "Say it," she said softly. "I've watched you rebuild yourself from the ground up over the last 5 months," Dylan said. "I've watched you take everything that man tried to break in you and turn it into something stronger than I've seen in anybody, man or woman, in this yard in 20 years. And somewhere in the middle of all that, watching you do it, I fell in love with you. I didn't mean to. I sure as hell wasn't looking for it. But it happened anyway, and I've been sitting on it for weeks because the last thing I ever wanted was to make you feel like you had to be anything for anyone else, not after everything you just survived." Claire sat frozen for a moment, the words settling slowly into her chest, filling a space she hadn't realized was still waiting to be filled. "I've been scared to say something too," she admitted quietly. "Not because I don't feel it back, because for 2 years love meant control. It meant fear. It meant losing pieces of myself one at a time until there was almost nothing left. I didn't know if I was capable of feeling it any other way anymore." "And now?" Dylan asked, his voice careful, steady. Claire looked at him, really looked at him, the gray beard, the tattooed arms, the vest that had once seemed intimidating and now felt like the safest thing she'd ever known. "Now, I think you've spent 5 months showing me exactly what it looks like when love doesn't ask you to disappear," she said softly. "It asks you to become more of yourself, not less." Dylan reached over slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. Claire didn't pull away. She held on. The months that followed brought Black Ridge Auto Salvage into a kind of steady, hard-won peace that none of them had truly believed possible during the darkest weeks of the fight. Marcus Hale's criminal trial began in early spring, and Claire testified for 2 full days, her voice steady throughout, backed by a mountain of evidence that made his defense attorney's efforts feel increasingly futile as the trial progressed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: wire fraud, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy. Marcus was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Claire sat in the courtroom when the sentence was read, Dylan beside her holding her hand the same way he'd held it that night in the office months earlier, and felt something inside her finally completely settle into peace. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt free. Outside the courthouse, cameras waiting for reaction, Claire faced them with a calm she never could have imagined finding 5 months earlier. "For 2 years, I believed the things he told me about myself," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That I was unstable, that I was lucky to have him, that nobody else would ever want someone as broken as he'd convinced me I was." She paused, glancing briefly at Dylan standing just behind her, then back at the cameras. I want every woman watching this who recognizes any piece of her own story and mine to know something. You are not what he told you that you are. You are not broken. You are simply waiting for the right place and the right people to remind you who you actually are. The clip aired on every local news station that evening, and by the following week, it had been shared by hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Claire's words are reaching far beyond anything she could have imagined when she'd first walked through the gates of a scrapyard nobody else wanted to work at. Claire. Renee flew out from wherever she'd relocated to attend the sentencing, and afterwards, standing outside the courthouse, she pulled Claire into a fierce, unexpected hug. You did what I was too scared to do for 4 years, Renee said, her voice thick with emotion. You made him actually answer for it. We did it together, Claire said. I couldn't have done any of this without what you gave me. You would have found another way, Renee said, pulling back to look at her. I watched you those 2 years, Claire, even when you didn't know I was watching. You were always stronger than he let you believe. It just took the right place to prove it. Patricia Hale, too, had attended the sentencing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her face carrying a complicated mixture of grief and relief that Claire understood better than most people ever could. I'm sorry, Patricia said afterward, meeting Claire outside, for everything, for the pattern I let continue for far too long. You broke it eventually, Claire said gently. That matters more than you think. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. I hope someday he understands what he threw away, she said quietly. Not just his career, his humanity. Claire thought about the man she'd once believed she loved, now facing over a decade behind bars, and felt something surprisingly close to sorrow beneath the relief. Maybe someday he will, she said. But that's not my responsibility to carry anymore. I spent 2 years carrying the weight of who he was. I'm done doing that. Black Ridge Auto Salvage celebrated its best year in the club's history, that following winter revenue up nearly 60% from where it had stood the year before. The yard, now known throughout Arizona, not just as a place that repaired engines and salvaged metal, but as a place that had once stood against corruption and won. Claire's official title changed twice that year, first to office manager, then as her responsibilities expanded into full financial oversight of the business to operations manager, a title Dylan insisted on personally presenting her with a small nameplate for her desk on a quiet Tuesday evening. That meant more to her than any framed diploma she'd ever earned in her old life. Claire Whitmore, operations manager, she read aloud, running her fingers over the engraved letters. Figured it was time to make it official, Dylan said, watching her with quiet pride. You've been running this place in every way that matters for months now. Paperwork should finally catch up. Claire set the nameplate carefully on her desk, positioning it exactly where she wanted it, then turned to look at him. 6 months ago, I walked through that gate not knowing if I'd survive the week, she said. Now I have a title, a home, a family I never expected to find in a place everyone else was too afraid to work. Best mistake 7 other people ever made, Dylan said, smiling. Their loss, our gain. Claire laughed, the sound easy and full in a way it had never been during her years with Marcus. On a quiet evening the following spring, nearly a full year after Claire had first arrived at Black Ridge with nothing but a broken suitcase and $42, she stood at the edge of the yard, and as motorcycles lined up in rows, the setting sun catching the chrome and casting long shadows across ground that had once felt so foreign and intimidating. She thought about the woman who had walked through that gate a year earlier, desperate, frightened, convinced the world had already decided everything worth deciding about who she was and what she deserved. That woman felt like someone else entirely now, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed the way scrap metal in this very yard was transformed every single day, stripped down to something essential, then rebuilt into something stronger than it had ever been before. Dylan came to stand beside her, following her gaze out across the yard, saying nothing for a long moment, simply present the way he had always been since that very first day. You ever think about what would have happened if you'd walked away that first morning, he asked quietly. If you'd let the 7 other people who quit convince you this place wasn't for you? Claire considered the question seriously before she answered. I think about it sometimes, she admitted, but I don't think I ever really had a choice to walk away. I think some part of me recognized this place before I even understood why. Recognized you. Recognized all of them. She looked up at him, the last light of the sunset catching in her eyes. I think I was always going to end up exactly here, no matter how many detours it took to arrive. Dylan reached for her hand, the same steady, certain gesture, that had carried them through the darkest months of the fight against Marcus, and Claire held on without hesitation. "This place isn't just full of broken machines anymore, is it?" she said softly, echoing a thought she'd carried with her since her earliest weeks at the yard. "Never really was," Dylan said. "It's always been a place where broken things get put back together. Engines, bikes, sometimes people who needed it most." Claire looked out across Black Ridge Auto Salvage, the mountains of scrap metal that had once seemed so intimidating, the men who had become her family, the office where she'd rebuilt not just a filing system, but an entire life, and felt something settle permanently into place inside her chest. She had walked through those gates a year earlier because nobody else wanted the job, because she had nowhere else left to go, because desperation had left her with no other option but to try. She stayed because she discovered piece by piece, day by day, exactly who she was capable of becoming when somebody finally handed her a chance instead of a cage. Marcus Hale had spent 2 years trying to convince her she was worthless, without him unstable, without his control, incapable of surviving on her own terms. He had been wrong about every single one of those things. And somewhere in a federal prison, serving out an 11-year sentence for the very corruption he'd once believed made him untouchable, Marcus would spend the rest of his confinement knowing exactly how wrong he had been, knowing that the woman he'd tried hardest to break had not only survived him, but had built something extraordinary directly out of the wreckage he'd left behind. Claire Whitmore had arrived at Black Ridge Auto Salvage with $42, a broken suitcase, and nothing left to lose. She left that version of herself behind in the dust of that scrapyard, piece by piece, day by day, until all that remained standing in her place was a woman finally, fully, unshakably, her own home at last, in the one place that had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was.